My new book, The Crash of 2016, is out now. That's why I'm on the road here doing the book tour. And in it, you'll find out how a small group of super wealthy citizens have co-opted our country and our government for their own personal gain. You'll find out about 80-year generational cycles of economic prosperity and severe crashes, which coincide with the citizenry's ability to forget the lessons from our own past. You'll learn how we can work to mitigate the effects of the forthcoming crash of 2016. And you'll learn the history of the Koch family and how they work with think tanks and media groups to destabilize our economy. Earlier today, I had the opportunity to appear on MSNBC's The Cycle to talk about the book.
New York Times bestseller Thom Hartmann warns 2016 could make the Great Depression look like child's play. His new book is The Crash of 2016, The Plot to Destroy America and What We Can Do to Stop It. Tom, thanks so much for joining us. How do you see us getting to this breaking point where we actually have sort of a calamitous crisis?
We've been here before. We saw the exact same thing happen in the 1920s. We saw the exact same thing happen in the 1850s. We saw something very, very similar happen in the late 1760s and early 1770s. Each time it led to a massive crash, which led to a massive political and economic rebooting of our country.
So the crash of 2016 is a coming economic, political, and social crisis that could be worse than any previous crisis our nation has ever faced. Like all previous great crashes, this one's going to be triggered, and in fact is being triggered, by economic disaster caused by many of the same forces that led to the crash of 2008, which was really the beginning of this, and the crash of 1929, which also went on for years. It's going to happen because the fundamentals that keep an economy strong and stable have not been restored since they started being deconstructed during the Reagan administration, the so-called Reagan Revolution, and were totally ripped apart at the end of the Clinton administration. The crash of 2008 was an early warning sign, but our response to it has not been adequate. Why 2016? Well, it actually could happen sooner. Could be next week. But I'm proposing 2016 for the same reason that 2008 happened. The crash of 2008 really began in 2006. That summer when housing starts dropped 34% and began to really seriously unravel. It probably should have happened in 2007, but the Bush administration saw it coming, and they threw everything they had into keeping it from happening before the November 2008 elections so that Bush wouldn't take the blame for it. They were unsuccessful, but not for lack of trying. The crash happened a half year before the elections and helped determine their outcome. There's every reason to believe that the Obama administration is doing the same thing right now and will get even more aggressive about trying to hold things together with baling wire and bubblegum all the way up until November of 2016. But there's another force at work here too: cycles. Every 80 years or so, roughly 4 generations, the United States encounters a major crisis. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, then about 80 years ago, the Great Depression and World War II. So this is a time when that cycle comes back around because the people who remember the mistakes and can warn us about them are pretty much all dead. So what is this economic royalist conspiracy? It's ultimately a plot to destroy the foundations of the American middle-class economy that were built during the New Deal, with roots farther back than that. And this plot, this modern-day plot, was hatched by new names and faces, but by the same ideology and the same kind of people who have run counter to American progress since the founding of our nation, the forces of greed, aggregate wealth, and rule by the rich. Franklin Delano Roosevelt explicitly called them economic royalists, and I think it's an entirely appropriate term. His memo paralleled the rise, this now being Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell wrote a memo that brought us to where we are now. And that memo paralleled the rise of a new anti-government theology expressed most vividly in the libertarian and objectivist movements inspired by Chicago School economics and Atlas Shrugged author Ayn Rand. Ronald Reagan played the role of the useful idiot by dropping the top marginal tax rate below 50%, by reducing corporate taxes, by changing our trade laws, and changing the rules governing CEO compensation. Perhaps most importantly, Reagan effectively stopped enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act, transforming America's cities and shopping malls from havens for small family-owned businesses to a nationwide homogeneous array of outlets owned by a small handful of corporations. The reality is, just like in nature, broad and diverse is strong Huge and top-heavy is fragile, and that's where our economy is now. Our Supreme Court then helpfully handed the Royalists a series of decisions, from Buckley versus Vallejo to First National Bank to Citizens United, that let predator billionaires and large corporations essentially buy the political process and lock in their profits and their power. So over the last 30-plus years, you see this concerted effort, this political, economic, and intellectual conspiracy toward remaking the United States in the image of the economic royalists. And they've been very successful, which is what has led us to the doorstep of the crash of 2016. Is there anything we can do about it now to stop it? Almost certainly not. Particularly with all this Republican obstruction. But we can mitigate just how bad it gets. There are generational forces beyond our control at work here that have historically forced the nation to change in a profound way. Jefferson wrote extensively about generational revolutions, so something is going to happen. And history tells us that this change can proceed peacefully, or it could be impeded or hijacked for other purposes, which tends to proceed rather violently. Which way it goes depends on our social movements, our politicians, and what's happening elsewhere around the world, especially in the Eurozone and in Asia. We must undo the damage done by the Royalists over the last 3 decades and build new, stronger defenses to protect the American middle class. Otherwise, we're screwed. Unfortunately, because of the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, and the institutional and political power that has been given by that to the Royalists, it's pretty unlikely that anything is going to happen until there's a crash so big that the American citizenry demands, like they did in the 1930s, real, genuine, and significant change. So what happens to the United States after the crash? We'll have to wait and see. But ideally, we come through this great crash a more secure, a more just, and more equal nation. Previous crashes, every single one, has given the United States enormous opportunity to progress. The Revolutionary War gave us democratic self-government. The Civil War put an end to slavery. The Great Depression and World War II gave rise to the American middle class. So the good news is that we don't need to look to any other country for our solution. We've done this before, right here in the United States, and we can and almost certainly will do it again.